Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. So my either or is central to my book, The Spinach King. I spent 7 years actually debating this either or. Either I was not going to write this book and leave the alternative narrative of my family, the Seabrooks, my grandfather, C.F. Seabrook, and the family business, Seabrook Farms, a narrative in which my grandfather stars as a humanitarian capitalist hero, or I was going to write the book, tell the truth about this man, and burn his reputation to the ground. So this story begins in the 19th century in New Jersey. At that time, New Jersey was full of vegetable gardens. They were very lucrative and productive, and in fact, the reason that the state is called the Garden State is because of all of those vegetable gardens. If you're sitting in traffic in the Holland Tunnel and looking at a license plate in front of you that says Garden State and wondering, where's the garden? That's where the garden was. The reason it was so productive is there was a mineral locally called marl, which the farm boys would dig out of pits and spread on the land. And occasionally they would unearth a giant bone while they were doing that, throw that aside, until the first generation of American paleontologists came around and realized those were dinosaur bones. And the very first dinosaur ever on display in the US at the Philadelphia Academy of Science in 1868 was the Hadrosaurus. And the reason it was called that was because it came from a marl pit in Haddonfield, New Jersey. So my grandfather was born in this region in 1881. He died in 1964. His father was a small vegetable farmer. And he learned the trade from him, but he hated farming. He hated it. He hated dirt, which is a problem if you want to be a farmer. He wanted to be an industrialist like his hero, Henry Ford. Henry Ford was 20 years older than my grandfather, and that's what my grandfather wanted to be. But he came of age at a time when horsepower was shifting to machine power, and he realized that instead of leaving the farm for industry, he could bring industry to the farm. And so that's what he set out to do. And he did it so successfully that he ended up being called the Henry Ford of agriculture. He was up and down in the 20s, but in the late 20s, he hit his stride when he met Clarence Birdseye. Now, Clarence Birdseye had invented the quick freezing process several years earlier. And the way he thought of the quick freezing process was he was, earlier than that, fishing with Inuit above the Arctic Circle, and he observed how a fish pulled from the water froze instantly in the air, and then later was reanimated and swam away. And he thought, if I could reproduce that process in a laboratory and patent it, I could make a lot of money. He was a capitalist. And so he had done that, and he had successfully quick frozen fish and poultry, but he hadn't figured out vegetables because vegetables were a little trickier. And so he asked my grandfather, who he knew was a very successful vegetable farmer, could you take a crack at it? And so my grandfather, who at this point had 3 sons, Belford, Courtney, and Jack, who was my father, all of them set to work on this problem. And in fact, they did come up with a process for quick freezing vegetables. It turned out you had to cook them a little bit first. You had to blanch them and then freeze them. And so they ended up packing all of Birdseye's frozen vegetables throughout the 30s and then through the Second World War. After the war, the Seabrooks started their own brand and went into competition with Birdseye, and that was Seabrook Farms. And that's the point at which this alternative narrative began to take shape, because the Seabrook family became the brand story. And this family of this man and his sons and their brilliance and their family values were a big part of the brand story. And newspapers and magazines picked up on it, sometimes doing editorials on the family because they were interesting, and that culminated in a Life magazine feature story that ran in 1955 that took up 5 pages of the magazine. And because Birdseye was a major advertiser in Life magazine, the advertising staff had to be kept in the dark about the story, because they would have probably tried to cancel it because they were giving Seabrook Farms free publicity when Birdseye was paying for it. Anyway, so the press loved it, but the story wasn't just for selling vegetables. The story was also for the workers. The inspiring story of my grandfather, who by this point had become a self-made man, even though he never was, who hauled himself up by his bootstraps and through hard work achieved everything that he achieved. That story was presented to the workers in order to get them to work hard and give them at least the promise that they could get somewhere, where that even if that promise was a lie, really. But some of his workers really loved him. And during the war, Japanese Americans were released from internment camps. Some 2,000 Japanese Americans came to Seabrook Farms to work on the farm. And then after the war, about 900 Estonians were released from displaced persons camps. They came to work on the farm and became American citizens. These people saw my grandfather as a savior who had stepped in at a time of great uncertainty and despair in their lives and given them a new hope. And so when he died, they actually created a museum that is there to this day. And so that narrative then took on brick and mortar reality, the alternative facts about the Seabrook family. In 2009, my father died, and when he died, he left me, among other things, a box with JMS, save for JMS Jr., that's me, he was JMS, written on it in black Sharpie. I opened this box and I looked into it, and I saw it were full of documents pertaining to my grandfather. So I took it home to Brooklyn and I started to go through it. The man inside this box, my grandfather, was nothing like the man inside the museum. The man inside the box was a monster. He was a cheat, he was a fraud, he was a liar. Far from being a family man, he had tried to destroy my father, and he had disowned my father. And in fact, the reason those documents were there was because after he died, the brothers tried to have his will thrown out by proving that he was insane. And so they had interviewed a lot of people around him at that time. And even though he was a friend to some workers, he definitely wasn't a friend to the African-American workers, who he completely discriminated against, treated unfairly, paid unfairly. And then when they had the courage to strike in 1934, he called in armed vigilantes and even talked with the local KKK and used violence to put it down. And then the African-American workers were totally written out of the company history going forward and were in no way present in that museum. So, why did my father not tell me any of this stuff when he was alive? And in fact, even though he had been disowned, my father carried on as though there had been no break and he was the natural heir of this kingly man, so much so that he took up this hobby, which is literally the sport of kings, four-in-hand driving, where you have four horses. You hold the reins in one hand, you hold the whip in the other hand, you have a top hat on your head, and you drive through, in his case, these country roads in South Jersey. His prize coach was called the Nimrod, and it was named after an Old Testament king. He shows up in Genesis. It said that Nimrod was a mighty hunter who became mighty in the earth. And my father was so enamored of this mighty hunter that he basically adopted Nimrod as his kind of mascot. He changed all the license plates on the cars to Nimrod 1, Nimrod 2, Nimrod 3. He changed the name of our road to Nimrod Road. We had these little cups that had the word Nimrod stenciled on it that you would drink gin and tonics out of while on the Nimrod. But unfortunately, as he was co-branding with Nimrod, the meaning of the word Nimrod was changing from a mighty hunter to a mighty doofus. That's right. By the 80s, if you went for a drive with my parents in one of the Nimrod fleet, you could guarantee there'd be flashing lights and honking. Once we got mooned, and at gas stations, it was like a shaming ritual. People were laughing at you. But the cruelest cut of all for my father was that the culprit, the thing that had changed the meaning of the word Nimrod was Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny had started calling Elmer Fudd Nimrod because Elmer Fudd was such a terrible hunter that it was mocking him by calling him Nimrod. And then Gen X took it up and basically made it a non-racist insult, kind of all-purpose, non-sexist, pretty good, really. There's not that many like that. And so the cruelest part was that my father's aspirations were defeated by a cartoon rabbit. At any rate, I pondered for years as I went through these documents, why did he leave me these documents? He knew I was a journalist. I am a journalist. He could have guessed that I would probably write about it. So did he want me to write this story? And I really struggled with that because, the alternative narrative, the false narrative, did give a lot of comfort to a lot of people who saw him as a man to admire and also kind of like reaffirm their belief in America in some ways. And so in tearing down that narrative, I was also destroying some of those hopes. That was one thing I wrestled with. I also wonder whether I would be betraying my family in a way that my grandfather seemed to have betrayed my family, and whether I was kind of perpetuating this cycle of family betrayal. But eventually I decided I'm going to write this book. And my reasons were this. It was, by that point, the early days of the first Trump era. And alternative facts and fake narratives the pernicious effect of them were beginning to become clear. And the way in which false narratives and alternative facts can be used to delude and trick people into believing in things that aren't actually in their benefit. I felt like I couldn't really stop that from happening, but I could stop that within my own family history from happening. And then I thought about my children. I have 2 children, and did I want them to grow up with this fake narrative, even though it was more inspiring in a way than the real narrative, which was darker and more ambiguous. But I actually decided I do want them to know the truth. I believe in, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with epigenetics, but the idea that trauma and pain can be passed down actually biologically from generation to generation. So your children can actually inherit the pain that you had if you haven't processed that pain. And I think I kind of inherited some of my father's pain, and that caused me, I struggled for a long time with alcohol, and I believe that that was part of the reason. I didn't want to pass that pain over to my children. That was the second reason. But the real reason, I mean, the most motivating reason, which is the least noble reason, was that I was pissed. I wanted revenge. When I read all that stuff that my grandfather had done to my father, I wanted to avenge my father for what he had done. I felt like this man needs to go down. And so I wrote the book that my grandfather deserved. Thank you very much.